Hello, everyone, and welcome to the session. My name is Jaideep Singh, and I'm the Secretary General of the MUN at Home program here at MUN Impact. And I'm happy to invite you all today to attend this wonderful session by a very special guest from the United Nations human from the United Nations Refugee Office, and that's Ms. Pauline Ellier. I've had the privilege of having Ms. Pauline Ellier speak to our MUN at Home delegates a few weeks back. And Pauline works in the Strategic Communications Department for the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency mandated to protect the 70.8 million people forced to flee their homes due to conflict and persecution. In this role, she helps develop strategies to generate empathy and drive action for refugees in the context of different emergencies. She also leads initiatives to engage students with refugee cause. And before joining the UNHCR, Pauline worked for the Red Cross and as a think tank specialist in peace negotiations. Pauline holds a master's degree in international affairs from the Graduate Institute of Geneva and Sciences Po, as well as certificates in digital law and digital strategy. And today she will be sharing with us about the MUN Refugee Challenge by the UNHCR. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Ms. Pauline to continue the proceedings. Thank you for joining us again, and all yours.
Hi, everyone. So it's a pleasure being there with you. I understand that the session is going to be translated, so I'll try not to talk too fast, pero es un placer encontrarlos, pero tengo que mejorar mi español. Próxima vez. So I'm going to share a presentation with you, and I'll try to leave time for questions that you have at the end, whether it's about me, about refugees, about UNHCR, about what you can do at your age. So let me just share it now. There. Okay. All right. Can you all see it? All right. I could make it bigger, but usually it doesn't work. So I'll leave it that size, and I'm just going to open it like that. So to start with, so I was introduced really well, so I'm not going to spend too much time introducing myself, but I'm Pauline and I work in communications for UNHCR, the United Nations Refugee Agency. Communications is a big part of our work because we have to inform people about forced displacement worldwide. We have to tell governments what they can do to protect refugees. We have to tell journalists so they can help spread the news when there's a new emergency. And importantly, we have to tell people about refugees so they understand who they are and that there are people who are fleeing conflict and persecution, and that they need support to be integrated into new countries or to go back home if they want to. So there's a lot of awareness raising that needs to be done. And Jaideep already told you about where I worked before, so I'm going to stop here. But maybe for you to know, I'm 29, and so not long ago, I was actually doing Model United Nations like you, as a delegate and then as a Secretary General. And that's really what motivated me to work for the United Nations. So I can really relate, to your experience. And you have any questions about working for the UN, I'm happy to answer. So there are many United Nations organizations, and it can be confusing sometimes. I remember when I was a delegate, I mainly knew about the Security Council and the General Assembly, but it's important to know that there are many different agencies that work quite independently. You have UNICEF, you have OCHA that coordinates humanitarian operation, you have WHO, you have OHCHR, and we are one of the biggest. We are UNHCR, not to be confused with OHCHR, which really takes care of refugees and in general, anyone forced to flee their homes because of conflict and persecution worldwide. And like JD mentioned, and actually the numbers have increased this year, there are 80 million people forced to flee. So it's a big responsibility. We need to protect these people. So we are a big organization helping specifically refugees across the world. So what's a bit crazy is that when UNHCR was created in 1950, it was supposed to last only 3 years. It was created to help refugees from World War II. But actually now, we've been working for 70 years. So our mandate has evolved, but we still need to protect people who flee war and conflict, which is why we still exist, unfortunately. In 1951, the Convention on the Status of Refugees was created to create a status that really protects refugees. In 1954, UNHCR received a Nobel Peace Prize for its work during World War II, and or to help refugees from World War II. In 1960, our work really expanded because there were a lot of crises, a lot of conflicts related to decolonization in Africa. So we had to work a lot and help populations there. In 1981, we received another Nobel Peace Prize. And then in 2000, there were new crises in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Myanmar that we had to take care of. So again, an increase in forced displacement. And there we go. In 2020, we are celebrating 70 years of work. So the headquarters of UNHCR is in Geneva, but we have offices everywhere in the world. So it's very likely that there's a UNHCR office in your country. In total, we are present in 130 countries. So we have to be in countries where there are refugees. We have to be in countries where we have resettlement programs, which means countries which accept the most vulnerable refugees. We have to be in countries that donate to UNHCR, and we have to be in countries where there is a conflict or where there was a conflict if refugees want to come back. And in total, this is coordinated by 5 regional bureaus, and we have 16,000 colleagues. So I don't know all of my colleagues, unfortunately, and I'm still learning every day because it's a really big organization. So going back to who UNHCR protects. I already mentioned that we protect refugees, but I have to explain a bit the distinction between refugees and other populations. So refugees, exactly, we protect actually 26 million of them. So refugees are people who were living in a country, for example, Syria, then there was a war, or they faced violence, and they had to cross a border to another country because it was so dangerous in their countries, they had to leave their country. So that's a refugee. A refugee has experienced war, they have lost their homes, and they had to move to another country. But then we also protect what we call internally displaced people, who are people who have also lost their homes, but they stayed within their home countries. So for example, they lost their house in one part of Syria, and then they moved 100 kilometers to another place, and they are internally displaced. So they didn't necessarily find another home, but they also need protection. So we also protect people internally displaced. And finally, we protect asylum seekers. So asylum seekers are people who are in the process of trying to get their official refugee status. So for example, what can happen is, I don't know, maybe someone in Syria at the beginning of the conflict, they didn't cross the border, but maybe they managed to fly directly to the US. And then in the US, they applied for asylum and they're waiting for their status to be confirmed. So a bit technical, but just for you to know, if you hear these terms, what the distinction is. So what does it represent in general, of the people forced to flee because of conflict? Actually, it's a lot because it's 1% of the entire population. That means that 1 in 100 people have lost their homes and had to live in their country or outside of their country to find protection. So that's why it's really important that there is an agency that is dedicated to the cause of people forced to flee. So what do we do exactly at UNHCR? Because I communicate, but of course, it's not the only job that we have to do to help refugees, right? So to help people understand, usually we distinguish into 3 phases of our work. So there is help, which is really the stage where people have just lost their homes, they are fleeing, they are crossing borders. We send our staff to really protect them, see what they need, give them shelter, give them water, give them food, give them hygiene kits, just so they are taken care of during the emergency. Importantly, we also protect their rights to cross a border to find asylum, so their right to access another territory. This is a fundamental right under international law. That means that if there is a war in a country next to yours, you cannot close your border to the people who are looking for protection, right? This is really important. So this, we advocate, we work with states to ensure that this right is respected. But then helping people survive and cross borders is not enough. So that's why we also have the hope stage, which is really, helping refugees rebuild their lives through education, through jobs, and also by encouraging local solidarity from the communities that host them. And then finally, we have the home stage, which is, the solutions that we try to find for refugees so that they don't need our help anymore, so that they are safe. So if, for example, there was a war in a country and the war is over and the situation is safe, we will help refugees return. Because what's really important to know is that most refugees, they actually won't return, but they cannot do it because it's too dangerous in their countries. But their dream is, for most of them, to, if they can, to return. So that's one option. But sometimes, we've had conflicts in Afghanistan for 40 years, in Somalia, in Syria. It's not stopping, or it's too dangerous yet to send people back, so we cannot. Another solution is resettlement. Resettlement is really for the most vulnerable refugees. It means that they flee their country, they go to another country, and then they can apply to be resettled to a country that is more able to welcome them. Because, for example, again, example of Syria, a refugee who comes from Syria goes to Lebanon. There are many, many refugees there. The conditions are not easy. For example, if you have a family, if you have medical needs, if you have a family member in another country, you can apply for resettlement and be maybe resettled with your family in the US, in Canada, in France, in countries that have a resettlement programs. I think it's only 35 countries that offer resettlement. And unfortunately, there's a lot of demand, but sometimes not enough spots for refugees to go. But it's really important, especially for refugees who can not come back home at all. Because some refugees, for example, they have fled because they were persecuted, or maybe they're homosexuals. And in their countries, if they come back, they're going to be put in jail, or they're going to be killed. Or maybe they have a problem with the government and they simply cannot come back, right? You can have many, many different reasons. Or maybe they have a religion that is not accepted back home. So it will be impossible for them to return. So these ones are really vulnerable, and they are prioritized for resettlement. And then finally, another solution is local integration. So for refugees who have been living for a long time in another country, sometimes the best solution is for the countries to officially recognize them as citizens, or give them visas that allow them to live like citizens, and stay there and integrate. So that's for our priorities. So then I wanted to show you a quick video about where refugees come from. So maybe before I show you the video, maybe try to think about, if I've mentioned some countries, but if you can try to think about some of the main countries where refugees come from, which usually are countries where of course, you have wars. So let me open it in another window. JD, can you see the new window with the video? Yeah, okay, cool, thanks. Oops. Oh, sorry, it's complicated. So where do refugees come from? All right, so I hope you were able to see it well enough. Next time I'm going to put it bigger. But as you could see, the main countries where refugees come from are Myanmar. So that's where you have the Rohingya refugees. South Sudan, which is very sad because, as you may know, there was South Sudan became independent from Sudan, and there was a lot of hope after that independence. And unfortunately, a war started, and is still going on. Afghanistan, Syria, and also Venezuela, which we mentioned because, as you may know, in Venezuela there's big economic crisis and political crisis. And at first we didn't really talk about refugees, but as the needs are getting bigger and bigger, and there are more than 4 million Venezuelans who had to cross a border, UNHCR has been more and more involved in that situation. So that's where refugees come from. But then, as you know, refugees are refugees because they had to cross a country. So they went somewhere else. So I'm going to show you another video about where they go. A lot of people think that all the refugees go to the rich countries, they go to the US, they go to the UK, they go to Canada, but actually not at all. It's too far away. The big majority of refugees, they just cross a border and they stay in the country that is next to their country. So 73% of refugees are hosted in neighboring countries, and 85% of refugees are hosted in developing countries, which means countries that aren't very rich and aren't very able always to help them without international help. So this is important to know, right? Most refugees, they don't cross 2,000 kilometers to go to Europe. They stay where they are because they're hoping to come back home at some point. So I'll show you which countries host the most refugees. Go back here. Let's see if that can be a bit bigger. Nope. Sorry about that. All right. So can you just confirm that you can see it, JD? Yeah, perfect. So all right, so I hope that helps you understand a bit the situation, where refugees are from, where they go. And actually at the end, there's going to be a little quiz. So if you remember some of that information, that's going to help you. Anyway, but what's really important for us is that people understand that refugees are people just like us, right? Refugees can be anyone. If there's a war and you have to, leave your home and go somewhere else, you become a refugee. That can happen to anyone, and no one is responsible. So we did a campaign with Lego. You probably played with Lego some years ago, to kind of explain to people that they shouldn't discriminate refugees, and that anyone could be a refugee, and that there's no way of knowing who a refugee is. So we did that campaign that was called Spot the Refugee, where we asked people to look at these posters and try to identify who was a refugee. And of course, the answer is, it's impossible to spot the refugee. It could be that person, that person. It doesn't really matter. A refugee is someone who was not very lucky and who had to leave their country and where they were born to save their lives. So what I wanted to tell you a little bit about also is about COVID-19 and the impact of COVID-19 on refugees and displaced communities. Because we have all been affected by COVID-19, of course, but at UNHCR, we had to do a lot of work during that period because refugees were in a very vulnerable situation. So why? So of course, first, there's a health challenge. A lot of refugees are very vulnerable to the virus because they live in camps, not all of them, but let's say half of them live in camps that are really overcrowded, where it's impossible to do social distancing, and where they have really limited access to health systems and to water and soap. So far, we haven't had a major outbreak. We also aren't able necessarily to do large-scale testing, but we haven't had a major outbreak. But still, the virus had been identified in dozens of refugee camps. So we have to be very, very, very careful. And we had to do a lot of extra work to try to protect refugees and put in place new measures so that it doesn't spread. And this is important to protect refugees, of course, but also for everyone, because we'll only be able to protect ourselves if we manage to help everyone who has the virus. Otherwise, it will continue to spread. So what do we do exactly to help them? I thought I would show you a picture that actually we have received from a young refugee who lives in Uganda. And he has drawn all the activities that take place in his camp to prevent COVID-19. So we thought that was like really cool because it's really showing everything. So first, of course, we give access to water and so that people can really wash their hands. We have new medical facilities so that refugees can get tested. We have here a refugee who is explaining to other refugees in the camp what to do, what measures to take to protect themselves from the coronavirus. And here we have a refugee who is distributing medical kits and hygiene kits to other refugees. That's an overview of what we do in camps. And by the way, if I speak too fast, Clara, feel free to tell me and I can try to adapt. Okay, thank you. So that's a bit of an overview. But importantly, COVID is not just a health challenge. It's really an economic challenge for everyone, but especially for refugees. Because already, so again, it's an international right that refugees should be able to work, but they are only able to do it in half of the countries. So that's something we're working on, trying to convince states to give more access to jobs and work visas. But COVID-19 has really worsened the situation because many refugees have lost their jobs, or maybe they had jobs on the black market when they weren't able to have official jobs. And these jobs were the first to be cut. So we have a lot of work to do to try to help refugees financially to be able to cope with the economic impact of COVID-19. And for example, in Lebanon, 50% of refugees have lost their livelihoods, so their jobs. And 70% say that they had to skip meals because of COVID-19. So it's really an extra layer of work for us to be there to protect refugees. So what can governments do to help in that situation? So first, governments can give refugees access to hospitals and healthcare, because in some countries, refugees cannot go to the hospital in the countries where they have found refuge. So this is absolutely key. Refugees should have access to health systems everywhere. It's really important. Someone who is sick should be able to go to the doctor. Second, you can include refugees in economic recovery plans. So if you plan to like create new jobs or have an economic program to help your population, include refugees. They also need that support. 3, you can also improve procedures to recognize the qualifications of refugee doctors, because actually, many refugees are really skilled. They were doctors in their countries, they were businessmen, and then they lost everything, they go somewhere else. And sometimes your diploma is not recognized, or you have lost your diploma because you didn't have time to take it with you. And so they go to another country and people say, I'm sorry, I don't know, have no proof that you are a doctor. Or maybe I know you're a doctor, but here, you need to study a bit more. So it can be very difficult for refugees. So what we tell states is try to make it easier for refugees who had qualifications to be able to become doctors. It's okay if they have to study more, but try to facilitate that process. Especially, in periods like COVID, it's so useful. Everyone who is a doctor, who is a nurse, should be able to practice their work. And finally, states, of course, really important that they support the UN, that they support local organizations to help improve conditions in camps. And also, and this has been difficult sometimes, as much as possible, maintain the right to territory. So many countries closed their borders during COVID, of course, but we told them, try to find, to compromise, try to test refugees who need to cross your border, rather than completely close your border, because you still have people who, there may be COVID, but there's also conflict. So try to maintain the right to territory. Okay, but in all of that, because when I describe all of that, sometimes it may sound like the situation is very difficult, but we should not forget that refugees are also part of the solution. you know, refugees are not just victims, they are really strong people. They have survived difficult things, but you know, they're very resilient. And many of them are also fighting against COVID. Some of them are doctors, nurses, some of them make soap in their communities, some of them are communications officers and they inform people in their communities. They do all kinds of jobs, really, just like you and me. They've been helping in different ways. So I wanted to show you 3 portraits of refugees that we worked with, and we worked with an artist to draw their portrait. Salima is a gynecologist in Pakistan. She's a refugee. She delivers 5 babies every day. And she's been, you know, she's continued to do that during COVID-19 in spite of all the challenges. And so we tell her story, and if we have time, I'll show you a video. She's amazing. Then Foni, she lives in Kenya. She fled Sudan. She's lost her dad. And she did a master's in communications. And now she is helping other refugees, informing them about all the health measures that they need to take, you know, telling them, you know, about washing their hands, about social distancing, all of that, because it's really important, right? If we didn't hear that on TV, or if we weren't told by other people what to do, we wouldn't have known. It's really important that some people have the job of informing people with the right information. And then Mohiman, he's a refugee from Iraq living in Iran, and he's a nurse. And he works in a hospital, and he does all the testing every day. He tests hundreds of people for COVID. And so he helps refugees and non-refugees, and he does an incredible work. So let me check where we are time-wise. Okay, I think I will stop soon so you can ask me some questions. I've covered maybe a lot, but so that's Salima, the refugee gynecologist. I won't show you the full video, but you should watch it. She's really amazing. That's an example of a robot that was built by refugees in a camp. It's a robot sanitizer, so it distributes soap. Sorry, the video is going to start. But that's to show you that you know, refugees can be like super innovative and, you know, come up with solutions, and, you know, they don't really need other people's help sometimes. And it's important, you know, to show that, you know, they're not just victims. And okay, so I think my internet connection is not working so well, but you can see the robot. It's a pretty cool one. And then really importantly, I wanted to come back to you, students. I don't know if all you are students or maybe not, but what can you do when you're young and you're trying to help, and you're ambitious, but you don't know that there's so much, you're not sure where to start. So I think it also really depends on your personality. We are all different, right? So we all find different ways of helping. There isn't one way that is right. So if you're motivated, you can, you know, go in your community and volunteer to help. You know, if you have refugees in your community, you can get in touch with local organizations and help them integrate, and you know, talk to them, help them learn the language, help them understand the new culture that, you know, that they're in, and really be open-minded. Maybe you have refugees in your school, you don't really know. Try to be open-minded. So if you hear of someone who's fled a country that he's a refugee, and, you know, what, you know, they need primarily is friends and support to rebuild their lives. And so that's one thing you can do. If you are in a university, maybe you can check with your university or the head of your university. They're offering scholarships for refugees, because this is something that can really, really help refugees. I think that it's not too bad, because 60% of refugees have access to primary school. But then as the years go, less and less refugees have access to education. And at university level, only 3% of refugees have access to bachelor's and masters. because they don't have the financial means, or because they need to stop to work, or because they are in a place where there's no university, there's no opportunity. So we have a consortium of universities that provide scholarships. Check with your university if they do that, and if not, ask them, whether they would be willing to give 1, 2, 3 scholarships a year to refugee and really invest. A lot of refugees are talented, and they have this extra motivation of studying, and it can be really win-win for the students and the universities. Then, of course, you always have the solution of donating or encouraging your families to donate. So to UNHCR or to another organization. So I know that you're young, so I'm not going to ask you to give all your saving to an organization, but we are trying to think more and more about how we can involve young people in fundraising, because I have been asked by a few students whether they can organize fundraising events in their schools when there's an emergency. So we're thinking about that. And then that was just a last example. You have apps where you can learn a language with the refugees. You have apps where you can meet a family of refugees for dinner. That, there's a lot of small things that you can do. Importantly, and finally, I come to the MUN Refugee Challenge. You can learn and debate and try to find solutions for refugees by debating during the Model United Nations conferences. And this is something that I really, really care about. And I started when I came to UNHCR, because I told my colleagues, the Model UN conferences are amazing. The students work so hard. They study the issues so hard. And sometimes they come up with great ideas and no one sees them. So that's why this year, for the first time, but I think we're going to continue every year, we challenge students everywhere to debate about issues related to refugees and find solutions during their Model UN conferences. And then they send us their resolutions and we evaluate them. And at the end of the year, we're going to give a prize to all the best Model UN conferences. And we're going to share the resolutions with policymakers, with diplomats, with states, and we're going to really highlight the best ideas that came from the MUN community. So far, we have 20,000 students involved directly in finding solutions. And of course, COVID, challenged a lot of that, but I'm so glad to see that some of the MUN conferences are becoming digital. And I hope that, if you're interested, you can join the MUN Refugee Challenge in the future. So I'm going to stop here because I want to make sure that we have time for questions. I include my email here if you want to ask me questions directly if we don't have time. And I'll let you ask your questions. And if we have a few minutes left, we can do the quiz. And really, you can ask me anything if there's anything that was unclear. I know it's a lot of information, but just be curious, and I'm very open to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Pauline. A big round of virtual applause for Pauline. Indeed, another brilliant presentation similar to the one we had at MUN at Home. And I'm sure our delegates must have had a tremendous experience learning about the Refugee Challenge. If you want to learn more about it, you can find out on the UNHCR website or even email Pauline herself. Let's now go into a few questions. We are a bit short of time. We can only take 1 or 2 since we need to finish in exactly 8 minutes. Let's take one question coming in from someone from Syria, Nenar, who joins us from Syria. And his question pertains to refugee, a sort of bad psychological perspective on refugees by citizens. So Nenar, please go ahead.
Hi, this is Nenar.
Your audio is a bit faint. Could you speak a bit louder, please, or bring the mic closer to you?
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you.
Oh, okay. My question is, how can we protect refugees from bullying at the camps? at the another countries comes, or when they just move for another city. I mean the psychology, not only with food, clothes, and something like this. At the end, actually, I'm a refugee from Syria. How can make people understand that we are all human, not just because I'm a refugee, that means that I'm less.
It's a really, really important question. So I think there's a bit two things. First, you are really right to mention that it's not just about the physical things or the physical protection. The mental health is really important, and refugees have experienced really difficult things. And of course, we also work with psychologists to listen to them and to accompany them where they are to recover from whatever they are experienced. We are always really amazed when we meet refugees by the courage and the resilience of some of these people. Many of them, they have lost family members, they have lost their homes. Can you imagine? Like everything that is really dear to you. So sometimes we are the ones being, surprised by actually the ability to see a brighter future for themselves. And recently we launched an art competition, and we received drawings from refugees and other kids from all over the world. And they were so positive. The ones from refugees, I was really surprised. It's really beautiful. And I think that we need to support them as much as we can, but really also realize that, the courage, as much as possible, try to make their life, look like, being back to normal. So give them everything that they need on an everyday basis, to help them rebuild their lives as much as possible. And then what you said about, what was it about explaining to people that, trying to make people understand that refugees are just people just like us. That's the big part of my job in communications. This isn't always easy. First, many people don't know who a refugee is. Many people, they're like, oh, refugees are just people who want a job, and they're going to come to my country, and what will I do? And they have fears. So a lot of the time we have to, to explain who refugees are, that, help them put themselves in the shoes of refugees. And we have realized that what is really effective is to share individual stories of refugees. Because when we tell people, oh, there are 80 million refugees, they're like, oh my God, that's not manageable. What can we do? It's not my responsibility. When we share individual examples of refugees, people are really able to relate, and then they're really able to understand that it could be them, that it could be anyone, and that refugees are courageous, and that refugees are talented, and that refugees are just human. So that's a lot of what we do in communications. So I encourage you to look at our website and our social media, and to look at some of the stories. If you're trying to convince people around you, we can share some of that, of these stories to help them relate. I hope that answers a bit your question.
Thank you, Paul, for the answer. Thank you, Nina, for your question, and we really hope your question has been answered. Unfortunately, we really need to wrap up the session now, because this room is to be used for the closing ceremony immediately after this. So thank you to all delegates who have joined us, and thank you to Poland for joining us again. We hope to have more collaborations with you in the future summits as well. And thank you, delegates. We hope to see you all in the closing ceremony, and enjoy the rest of the session of the Global Summit. Goodbye, and take care.
Thank you, Jaydeep. Thank you, Pauline. I just wanted to say that my students in January did the Refugee Challenge at our conference, and they had a lot of fun. So if you've got a conference coming up, even if it's online, maybe have a look at that on their website. It's in the Get Involved section, because it is well worth doing. Thanks, everyone. I'm closing the room. Thank you to our interpreters, and I'll be opening the room back up, the webinar, for the closing ceremony. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.